Krause is the course director at Oxford's Latin American Centre and coordinator of the Brazilian Studies Programme. Before joining Oxford, he taught at the Centre of Latin American Studies at Cambridge, and he holds both a master's and a PhD from the University of Oxford. He previously served as a diplomat in the Brazilian Foreign Service, including roles as Deputy Ambassador in Bangladesh and as head of the economic section at Brazilian Embassy in London. His research explores the intersection of social movements and political economy in Latin America, especially how communities and NGOs respond to regulatory frameworks and advocate for alternative approaches to public policy. We are very fortunate to have him with us today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Felipe Krause.
Is going to be a very difficult act to follow. Congratulations to the singers, that was really amazing. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished delegates, fellow believers in diplomacy and dialogue, good afternoon to everyone. It's such a pleasure to join you at the end of Oxford MUN. I know how intense these days can be. Long committees and intense negotiations, draft resolutions you've edited so many times. They start to develop personalities of their own. You've created alliances, you've broken alliances, and you've probably found out that in the end, the surest path to consensus is having a good debate, and maybe sharing a laugh, or maybe sharing a meal. So, congratulations. That is real diplomacy in action. And I want to talk to you about the institution that's at the heart of all of this, the United Nations. And I want to situate it in a moment of profound uncertainty. Not only geopolitical uncertainty, but a deeper kind of uncertainty, a crisis of confidence in the very idea of global cooperation. Because this year, the UN turns 80 years old enough to have real wisdom, but also old enough to have very real and very harsh critics. Old enough to make us stop and ask, what does the UN mean today in a world that's more interconnected than ever, and yet more divided than at any time since 1945? And I want to frame this moment through a simple idea. We're living through a crisis not only of institutions, but of imagination, a crisis of cosmopolitan imagination. For decades, cosmopolitanism was respectable, even a fashionable word. A belief that being connected to the world was a strength. Now, it's often used as an insult. Globalist has somehow become a slur. And yet, the problems that define our century, climate change, pandemics, cyber conflict, mass displacement, these issues care nothing for borders. We face global challenges, but too often we respond with national reflexes. The world needs more cooperation precisely at a time when governments are offering less. And this dilemma, this gap between the global need and the national instinct, it's now testing the UN in ways that we haven't seen in generations. I think the UN is facing a crisis of confidence. Member states are asking blunt questions. Is the UN effective? Is it worth it? Is it sufficient. Consider the crises unfolding before our eyes. In Gaza, the last 2 years have made the limits of multilateral action painfully clear. Despite the promising breakthrough recently in Resolution 2803, which finally points towards a UN role in keeping peace, the reality is that the worst of the devastation has already occurred. The international system watched a humanitarian catastrophe unfold without the capacity or the political will to contain it. In Ukraine, a permanent member of the Security Council invaded a sovereign neighbor, a direct assault on the UN Charter, and the system couldn't prevent it. In the South China Sea, we see military maneuvers, dangerous signaling, and a real risk of miscalculation, without any meaningful multilateral mechanism to de-escalate. And on climate change, we've just lived through one of the hottest years ever on record. The world now experiences 5 times more climate-related disasters than in the 1970s. Yet global emissions are still rising, and the UN struggles to produce binding commitments with real enforcement. And then there's the question, the very important question of funding for multilateralism. The United States has drastically reduced its contributions to the UN, and other states, instead of stepping up to the plate, have followed the US. And UN agencies are now asked to do more with less, and sometimes to do the impossible with nothing at all. All of this fuels this narrative that the UN is outdated or ineffective. But I think that that narrative misses something essential, something that becomes clear the moment we zoom out and look not at 1 year or at one crisis, but at 80 years of human progress, of achievements made possible because of the UN and its many agencies. Let me illustrate this with a few facts. In 1975, a little girl born in Bangladesh could expect to live 52 years. Today, a girl born in the same country can expect to live 75 years, more than 20 extra years of life, because of sanitation and nutrition and vaccines and so many other things that the global system helped to deliver. In Ethiopia, in 1990, 1 in 5 children died before the age of 5. Today, that number is 1 in 20. That is millions of lives lived and parents spared unimaginable loss. In the late 1980s, when I was a child, polio paralyzed 350,000 children every year. Last year, there were 6 cases worldwide. 6. Because global cooperation works when we allow it to do so. Or think about this. Only 30 years ago, 40% of humanity lived in extreme poverty. Today, that figure is 10%. This is the biggest improvement in human well-being ever recorded. And yes, this has a lot to do with economic growth in places like China. But even there, it has been heavily supported by donor alignment, by global development frameworks, and yes, by UN coordination. Or think about the incredible work that goes into humanitarian response. When floods submerged Pakistan in 2022, affecting 33 million people, UN agencies and their NGO partners were on the ground within hours, delivering food and water and shelter and medical care. No single nation could have done that. In Liberia, a child born in the 1990s knew only war. A child born today knows only peace. It was UN peacekeepers that helped to disarm militias and rebuild institutions and support elections. And this is only one of many success stories that rarely makes headlines precisely because it worked. But behind every number is a life. And behind every life is quite often the quiet work of the United Nations, of global cooperation. And even when the UN is not perfect, the absence of the UN would be catastrophic. You know, I remember once in a multilateral negotiation in New York, two ambassadors, I won't name names, but two ambassadors spent an hour arguing over whether the word to be used should be encourage or urge. An hour. And at some point, I realized this is diplomacy. It's slow, it's frustrating, quite often it's really absurd. But every once in a while in those long meetings, you see something remarkable happen. Countries that don't agree on anything, suddenly they manage to agree on something. And that something can save lives. That's the hidden miracle of multilateralism. And that moment stayed with me. It reminded me that the UN, it's not just a building in New York, it's certainly not just a stage for speeches, it's an idea. The idea that countries, even when they disagree, that they can still come together and solve problems that are too big for anyone. For 80 years, the UN has been doing exactly that. Not perfectly, not always visibly, but consistently. It has helped create the humanitarian machinery that we now take for granted. It has kept rival powers talking, even in moments of tension. And it has coordinated development progress on a scale with no precedent in history. And in a world where nationalism is rising, the UN is still one of the few places where cosmopolitan values still have a home. Values that recognize that our fates are all connected, whether we like it or not. But those values don't maintain themselves. They need care, they need defending, and they need people who believe in them. Which brings me to the people in this room. Your generation will inherit a world whose challenges don't stop at borders, but whose politics often pretend that borders are enough. This means that you will face decisions that my generation didn't face in quite the same way. Will you turn inward or outward? Do we see international cooperation as optional or essential? Do we treat cosmopolitanism as naive or as necessary? And I don't want to tell you what to think, that's not my job. But I can tell you what I've seen in diplomacy and in development and in humanitarian crises. The problems that matter most always are the ones that we can't solve alone. Here at Oxford MUN, over these past few days, you've already shown something very important. That you can argue fiercely and still cooperate. That you can defend your position and still listen. That you can disagree without dehumanizing. That you can imagine solutions that don't yet exist. I think those are the instincts that sustain multilateralism. So I said earlier that we're living through a crisis of cosmopolitan imagination, but crises of imagination are not permanent. There are choices and they can be reversed. Cosmopolitanism does not ask us to abandon our countries. It asks us to enlarge our sense of belonging. It asks us to remember that the air that we breathe and the climate that we depend on and the technology that we use, the epidemics that we fear and the peace that we rely on, all of these transcend borders. Cosmopolitanism is not a weakness. It's not a betrayal of national identity. It's a recognition of reality. And it's precisely that worldview that we need to confront the century ahead. So, as we close this conference, and as you return home with your notes, and your placards, and your many wonderful memories, and hopefully several new friends from around the world, I want to leave you with this. The UN isn't perfect. It's never been. But it's still essential. It's still capable of remarkable things. 80 years ago, people who had survived World War and genocide believed in the possibility of global cooperation. They had to. They believed in dialogue over destruction, and they believed in building a world that could prevent the catastrophes that they had lived through. Today, the responsibility to defend that vision lies with you. So take what you have learned here and carry it with you into your universities, into your careers, into your public lives. Carry it into a world that desperately needs your voice. And above all, never apologize for being a global citizen. Our interconnected world needs that identity now more than ever. So with that, thank you very much indeed.